I'm Phil Bolton with the Global Atlanta News Service, and I'm here today with Delano Roosevelt, the grandson of former President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Mr. Roosevelt, welcome.
Thank you.
What brings you to Georgia?
Well, I have got a call from a friend of mine by the name of Wayne Reese. And Wayne is the chairman of the Franklin Roosevelt Institute for Rehabilitation in Warm Springs, Georgia. And they have some tremendous plans for renovating and bringing the Institute into the 21st century. And most folks go, "Why? I wasn't even aware it was still around," and when in fact it is. It's been proudly providing services to our country since my grandfather, came upon it way back when. So that's what originally brought me down here. I was looking for a family member that had an interest in getting involved with our new mission of bringing it. It is up to current standards, but we'd like to make it even better. And we have some 900 acres out in Warm Springs with these wonderful little cabins all throughout. And we thought, what a neat idea if we could find a way to redo these cabins and start bringing our military folks that in desperate need of rehab from Iraq down to Warm Springs in the great state of Georgia for rehabilitation, since there's been the problems with Walter Reed Hospital, and also there will be, I'm sure, quite a waiting list for good facilities. Well, we are one of those good facilities, and the neat thing about what our concept is that given these little cabins that we have on the property, we could bring the whole family down here to heal together.
I had the pleasure of seeing an HBO special fairly recently. Were you aware of that?
Oh yes, that was actually, in my humble opinion, one of my all-time favorites with regard to films or books about the family or Franklin or Eleanor, because it really it showed a completely different side of the man, much more humanistic side of the man to the United States. I'm sure spanning from some seniors that are still around that remember FDR in person to younger folks that just learned about FDR and Eleanor through books. And the poignant part of this, I thought, which really touched my heart, was them showing here is a man who led our country through a Great Depression, a World War, fought on both sides of the planet, yet here he was going through the same emotional problems that we all face on a daily basis of personal strife. And the man was, when he found out he had he contracted polio, he went south, pardon the pun, personally, drank a lot, attempted suicide, and if it wasn't for Warm Springs finding him or him finding Warm Springs, I don't think that he would have come out of it the same man that we know today.
Is there a widespread recognition of your grandfather's role?
Yes,
in developing U.S.-Saudi relations? In
1945, FDR, which most people know, attended the Yalta Conference with Stalin and Churchill. At the conference, while the conference was going on, Churchill was meant to leave the conference and steam up to meet with the king to talk about joint venturing to explore the oil reserves, which they knew they had some, but they had no idea to what extent. And prior to that meeting, the king asked his advisors and said, well, before we meet with Churchill, he says, tell me about the Americans. Does the Americans, as a rule, do they colonize? No, Your Highness, they don't colonize. Do they believe in God? They most absolutely do believe in God. He says, I want to meet with Roosevelt first, which he did. And so, unbeknownst to Winston Churchill, FDR sailed up on the USS Quincy to Jeddah and hooked up with the USS Murphy, which picked up the king from Jeddah, which was a fiasco in itself because it was very secretive. And the king, all of a sudden, the word got around the king was in Jeddah. And no one knew why the king was there. And then there's an American gunship in the harbor. And typically when a dignitary of that stature boards, they'll do a gun salute. As fate would have it, as the dignitary arrives on board the vessel, well, as fate would have it, one of the guns had inadvertently been turned around, even though it was shooting blanks, and they shoot off the guns, and the gun was firing towards Jeddah. Wow. So now all the locals don't know why the king's there. Our king is being rushed aboard an American gunship, and they're shooting at us. And it caused tremendous chaos. But obviously, the word got out, and His Royal Highness King bin Saud and FDR met for 12 some hours. The king's guards and the U.S. naval folks, the guys on board the ship, were able to intermix with each other and trade and talk. And a few things happened at that meeting. FDR promised the king that he would get the protection that he needed while exploring and drilling for oil. He also got a relationship with our U.S. Department of Agriculture to help. They were having tremendous problem with, of course, you can imagine the winds through Saudi Arabia. Growing something as simple as wheat, it would just demolish the wheat fields. So we helped them create what's now known as a dwarf wheat, which is about half the size. It's very robust, and it has about the same yield. The king had never flown in an airplane before, so FDR made a gift of a DC-3, and the king loved flying around. He purchased 2 more DC-3s and started what is now known as Saudi Arabia Airlines. And with the relationship that was created between what was then Standard Oil of California and Texas Oil, which is now Texaco and Chevron now, they created what's now known as Aramco. So there's a tremendous personal bond between the two men. Set aside, heads of nations and leaders of state, they really liked each other, which was evident because when FDR came home from the trip, he was meant to come home directly from Yalta. Most folks can remember in the history books, you had pictures of him at Yalta, and you could see that death really had a pretty good grasp on him at that time. And he needed to get to Warm Springs to recoup. Well, on his way back to Warm Springs from the meeting with the king, he made an unprecedented stop in Washington, D.C., and had a joint session of Congress. Typically, that's done on an annual basis. And very typically, if not exclusively, the president is invited by the House and the Senate to give the State of the Union. It's not the other way around, but he called a joint session. And one of the things, whether or not he had an inkling of his fate or not, which might have motivated that, who's to know. But one of the things that he made that's in the record of Congress, he said, with regard to in the areas of diplomacy, he says, in the couple of days that I've spent with the King of Saudi Arabia, I learned more about the man and his people and their culture in 2 hours of direct conversation than I did over the last several years of diplomatic communiques and letters, which is, I think, is relevant to even to our present time, where just sitting down and talking with somebody can solve so many problems. Because as simplistic as some people say it might be, once you've sat down and talked to someone and you talked about your families and your children and your desires to raise these children in a safe and harmless world, and you also discussed and found out that you might like eating some same meals or shared a meal by chance, it's a lot harder to kill that person. And so then he went to Warm Springs and subsequently passed away after that trip. Needless to say, in summing that trip up, Churchill just hit the roof when he heard that FDR had, because he knew that if FDR got to Saudi Arabia before him, that all bets were off for Britain to strike any deal with the kingdom.